There is a particular kind of dark that only exists in winter, in a world before electric light, and tonight I want to take you into it. Pull the blanket up a little higher. Let your eyes close if they want to. I am simply going to talk quietly about something true. Picture a single room somewhere in the countryside of northern Europe, perhaps 600 years ago. The walls are made of woven branches packed with mud and straw. The roof is thatch heavy with the season's first frost. Inside there is one fire, and around that fire an entire household survives the night. A husband and a wife, several children pressed close together for warmth. Sometimes a grandmother, sometimes an aunt, sometimes a hired hand with nowhere else to go. And often just on the other side of a low wooden partition the animals. The family cow, a handful of goats, maybe a pig fattened all autumn for this exact season, breathing out its own small warmth into the shared air. This is not a story about castles, it is not a story about kings or queens or grand battles fought in the snow. It is something quieter, and in some ways far more remarkable. It is the story of how ordinary people with nothing but fire instinct and each other managed to survive a season that genuinely tried to kill them every single year for 1,000 years. I find myself thinking about this often. We live now in a world where winter is an inconvenience. We complain about the cold on our walk to the car. We adjust a thermostat without rising from the couch. But for most of human history, winter was not an inconvenience. It was a test. A long, patient, recurring test that returned every year whether anyone was ready for it or not, and many people were not ready. Many people did not pass. I wonder sometimes what it actually felt like to lie awake at 3 in the morning in a house like that one, listening to the wind, test the thatch above your head, wondering quietly whether the firewood stacked against the wall would last until spring. I wonder what it felt like to watch your breath turn visible inside your own home. I wonder what it felt like to know with complete certainty that the difference between your family surviving the season and not surviving it might come down to how much grain you had managed to store back in September. These are not dramatic questions, they are domestic ones. And that, I think, is exactly why they deserve to be asked. The history that gets remembered tends to be the history of armies and crowns. The history that actually shaped most human lives for most of human existence was the history of getting through the night. So tonight that is where we are going, not to a battlefield, not to a royal court, into one of these winter houses, into one of these long dark seasons, somewhere in medieval Europe, sometime between the 11th and the 15th century, when the climate itself was beginning to shift beneath people's feet and nobody yet had a name for what was happening to them. There is something else I should say before we go further. I think it matters. The title of this story includes the word brutal, and that word is accurate. The cold was real. The hunger was real. People did die in numbers that would unsettle us if we encountered them today. But I want to be honest with you about something else too. This is not a story I am telling to frighten you or to keep you anxiously awake wondering what happens next. It is a story I am telling because I think there is a strange deep comfort in understanding how people endured the hardest things. Not because their suffering is comforting, but because their resilience is. There were entire civilizations, entire centuries built on the quiet, unglamorous skill of simply getting through winter. And somehow most of the time most people did. Before we go any further, I want to ask something of you, and it will only take a moment. If this kind of history is the sort of thing that draws you in, the kind told slowly, honestly, without rushing towards the next dramatic beat, it would mean a great deal if you considered subscribing and leaving the video a like. Small as that gesture seems, it genuinely helps stories like this one continue to be told. And if you have a moment, I would love to know where you are tucking in from tonight and what it was about this particular story that made you want to stay. I read those comments more often than you might think. Now, if you are comfortable, if the lights are low, and the night feels right for this, let us begin properly. Because to understand what winter actually demanded of people in this era, you first have to understand what their world looked like the rest of the year. It was a world built almost entirely around the rhythm of growing seasons. Spring for planting, summer for tending, autumn for the frantic essential work of harvest, and then, waiting at the end of all of it like a closed door at the end of a long hallway, winter. For the vast majority of people living across medieval Europe, life was agricultural, local, and almost entirely dependent on what could be grown, stored or raised within walking distance of home. There was no refrigeration, no reliable transportation network capable of moving food quickly across regions in a crisis. No reserve of imported grain waiting in some distant warehouse. What a household managed to store by the first frost was, in a very real sense, what that household had to survive on until the ground thawed again. If the harvest had been good, winter was difficult but survivable. If the harvest had failed even partially, winter could become something else entirely, and the climate itself in this period was not always cooperative. Across much of the era we are exploring tonight, Europe moved gradually from a period of relative warmth into a long cooling shift that historians now sometimes call the early stages of a little ice age. Summers grew shorter and wetter in certain regions, growing seasons narrowed. Harvests that had once been reliable became less certain year over year in ways that the people living through them could feel even if they could not yet explain why. They did not have a word for climate change. They did not understand atmospheric patterns or shifting ocean currents. What they understood was simpler and more immediate. The rye was failing more often than it used to. The frost was arriving earlier in the autumn and lingering longer into spring. The river that used to remain navigable through most of the cold months was now freezing solid for weeks at a time. Something was changing, and whatever it was making winter harder. This is the world we are stepping into tonight. Not a single dramatic event, but a slow tightening of conditions, season after season, that would eventually produce one of the most devastating stretches of hardship medieval Europe had ever faced. We will get there. We have time. That is, after all, rather the point of tonight. But first I want to spend a little longer in that ordinary cottage I described a few minutes ago, because before we can understand the crisis, we need to understand the quiet, daily, almost invisible labour of simply preparing for the cold, the chopping, the smoking of meat, the careful rationing of candles that most households could not actually afford to burn very often. There is an entire world of human ingenuity hiding inside that preparation, and it deserves its own attention before the difficult parts of this story arrive. So settle in a little further. There is more to this house, more to this season, and more to these people than the cold alone. And in a moment we will step further into the autumn that came before everything changed. Let me tell you about a smell that almost no one alive today has ever encountered, but that every single person in medieval Europe would have known instantly the moment they stepped through their own front door in late autumn. It was the smell of a house being sealed for winter. Smoke, tallow, drying herbs, damp wool, and underneath all of it the faint sweetness of stored apples slowly turning soft in a dark corner. Every cottage carried some version of this scent by the time the first hard frost arrived, and it meant something specific. It meant the household had done what it could. It meant the real waiting had begun. The preparation itself started long before anyone felt the cold. By late summer, families were already thinking about winter in the same quiet, persistent way a person today might think about a deadline they cannot ignore. Hay needed cutting and drying for the animals. Grain needed threshing and storing in a manner that would keep it safe from damp, from rats, and from the slow rot that could ruin an entire season's harvest within weeks if the storage was poor. Wood needed felling, splitting, and stacking in quantities that to modern eyes would look almost absurd. Historians who have studied household records from this period estimate that a single family might need somewhere between 10 and 20 cartloads of firewood to make it through one winter, depending on the severity of the season and the size of the home. That wood had to be cut by hand, carried by hand, and stacked by hand, often by the same people who are also bringing in the harvest tending animals and preparing every other part of the household for the months ahead. And here is something that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. For most peasant households, meat was not the primary source of winter calories. It was something closer to an emergency reserve, carefully rationed, and often saved for the hardest stretches of the season. The real foundation of survival was grain, specifically the kind of dense dark bread made from rye barley, or whatever combination of grains a region's soil could support. This bread was not the soft, fluffy thing we associate with a bakery today. It was heavy sour, sometimes mixed with ground peas or beans to stretch the flour further, and it was eaten almost constantly at every meal as the backbone of a person's daily energy through the coldest months. A medieval peasant might consume what would seem like an enormous quantity of bread by modern standards, simply because there was very little else providing the calories needed to keep a human body generating heat in a poorly insulated home. The animals, meanwhile, posed their own quiet crisis every year. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs could not simply graze through a European winter the way they did in summer. The grass was gone. The ground was often frozen or buried beneath snow. This meant that every animal a family kept alive through the winter was an animal that needed feeding from the same limited stores the humans themselves depended on. And so every autumn, households faced a brutally practical calculation. How many animals could realistically be fed until spring, and how many needed to be slaughtered now while there was still time to preserve the meat through salting, smoking, or drying? This is actually where one of the more interesting overlooked details of medieval winter life comes in. The slaughter season, often centered around late autumn, was not simply about preparing food, it was about survival math. Keep too many animals alive and the family risked running out of feed by midwinter, watching their livestock starve anyway, having wasted the grain that might have fed the household instead. Slaughter too many and they lost the breeding stock needed to rebuild their herd the following spring. There was no perfect answer. There was only experience, instinct, and a fair amount of anxious calculation carried out by people who understood with complete clarity that this single decision could shape the difficulty of the months ahead. I think what strikes me most when I sit with this part of the story is how much quiet intelligence existed inside these decisions. We sometimes imagine medieval peasants as simple, almost passive figures, waiting for history to happen to them. But the reality inside that cottage was closer to a household running a continuous high-stakes logistics operation season after season, generation after generation, with almost no margin for error and no safety net beyond their own preparation and their neighbours' goodwill. And that idea of neighbours matters more than it might first appear. Villages in this period operated on systems of mutual obligation that modern life has largely lost. If one family's harvest failed while another's succeeded, there were often informal, sometimes formal expectations of sharing lending or trading that helped distribute risk across a community rather than letting one household collapse in isolation. This was not pure altruism. It was also self-interest woven into the fabric of survival. A community where everyone starved alone was a community that eventually had no one left to plant the next spring's fields. So winter, in a strange way, also revealed and reinforced the social bonds that held these villages together. The cold did not just test individual households. It tested the strength of an entire community's willingness to look after itself. Now here is where the story begins to shift from the local and the personal towards something larger, something that was happening across the entire continent during this era, mostly invisible to the people living through it. Beginning sometime in the high medieval period and intensifying as the centuries went on, Europe's climate was undergoing a long, gradual transformation. For several centuries earlier, much of the continent had experienced what climate historians now refer to as a warm period, sometimes called the medieval warm period, during which growing seasons were longer, harvests were generally more reliable, and population across much of Europe grew steadily as a result. Vineyards flourished in parts of England where grapes would later become nearly impossible to cultivate. Settlements expanded into regions that had previously been considered too marginal for reliable farming, but that warmth did not last forever. Beginning roughly in the 13th century and continuing with increasing severity into the 14th, the climate began a slow cooling shift. Scholars still debate the exact combination of causes behind this transition. Some point toward changes in solar activity. Others highlight volcanic eruptions that sent ash and sulfur high into the atmosphere, subtly dimming sunlight and lowering temperatures across the hemisphere for years at a time. Still others emphasize shifts in ocean currents, particularly in the North Atlantic, that altered weather patterns across the continent in ways still being reconstructed today through ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers. The honest truth is that no single explanation fully accounts for everything that happened, and the scientific record, while increasingly detailed, remains an evolving picture rather than a finished one. What we do know with reasonable confidence is the effect this shift had on the ground in villages just like the one we have been imagining tonight. Growing seasons shortened. Summers grew wetter in many regions, which sounds harmless until you understand what excess rain actually does to a grain harvest. Wet summers delay ripening, encourage fungal disease in standing crops, and make the harvest itself far more difficult since grain cut and stored, while still damp, will rot in storage rather than keeping through winter. Winters themselves grew colder, and in many records longer, stretching the season during which households depended entirely on stores that had been calculated for a shorter, milder cold. And this is the part of the story I find genuinely haunting in the quiet, contemplative sense, rather than anything frightening. The people experiencing this shift had no framework for understanding it as a pattern. They did not know they were living through the early edge of a multi-century climatic change. To them, each difficult harvest simply felt like bad luck, or perhaps divine displeasure, or perhaps the natural unpredictability of weather that had always existed and always would. They adjusted as best they could, household by household, village by village, without ever seeing the larger shape of what was happening to the world around them. For a while, this adjustment mostly worked. People are remarkably adaptable, and medieval communities developed an impressive range of strategies for absorbing difficult years. They diversified crops where soil allowed it. They built communal grain stores in some regions intended specifically to buffer against a single bad harvest. They relied on those networks of village obligation I mentioned earlier, lending grain and livestock across families in difficult seasons, trusting that the favour would eventually be returned. But resilience, however impressive, has limits, and the particular stretch of years we are moving toward now in this story represents the moment when those limits were tested in a way that few in medieval Europe had ever experienced before, and that almost none of them were prepared for. Something was shifting quietly in the sky and in the soil, beyond anything a single household's woodpile or grain store could fully protect against. And in a season not far from where we are sitting in this story right now, that shift was about to arrive all at once. There is a date that almost no one outside academic circles has ever heard, and yet it marks one of the most consequential turns in the story we are telling tonight. The year is 1315, not a battle, not a coronation, just a spring that refused stubbornly and almost incomprehensibly to behave the way spring was supposed to behave. Across much of northern Europe that year, the rain simply would not stop. Chroniclers writing at the time, men in monasteries and cathedral schools who kept careful records of weather alongside their Religious duties describe rainfall so persistent that fields meant for planting remained underwater well into what should have been the growing season. Rivers that normally settled into Brazil's predictable seasonal patterns overflowed their banks repeatedly. Roads turned to impassable mud for weeks at a stretch, which mattered enormously in a world where moving grain from one region to another depended entirely on carts and pack horses able to travel those roads. When farmers finally managed to get seed into the ground, much of it rotted before it could properly germinate, sitting in waterlogged soil that never had the chance to dry. The crops that did manage to grow came in week late and in drastically reduced quantities. And this was not a single bad harvest in a single unlucky region. It was happening across an enormous stretch of the continent, from Ireland through England, across much of France and deep into the German lands, all in roughly the same span of time. What makes this moment genuinely remarkable in the quiet sense I keep returning to tonight is that nobody experiencing it understood they were living through the opening months of a famine that would stretch on for 2 full years, sometimes recorded by historians as lasting into a third. People living through 1315 simply believed they had endured one extraordinarily difficult season, the kind that happens occasionally, the kind a community absorbs and recovers from. They had no way of knowing that 1316 would bring more of the same, and then 1317 as well. This stretch of years has come to be known among historians as the Great Famine, and it stands as one of the most severe subsistence crises in recorded European history, predating the more widely remembered catastrophe that would follow roughly 3 decades later. I want to sit with that distinction for a moment because I think it matters. Most people, if they know anything at all about hardship in medieval Europe, know about the plague that arrived in the middle of the 14th century. Far fewer know that an entire generation earlier, an almost equally devastating crisis swept across the same regions, driven not by disease, but by something more fundamental still: the simple total failure of the food system that an entire civilization depended on. The numbers that survive from this period are imperfect, pieced together from tax records, monastic chronicles, and scattered local accounts rather than any centralized census. But even with that uncertainty, the patterns that emerge are sobering. Some estimates suggest that mortality during these years rose by somewhere between 10 and 15% across affected regions, concentrated heavily among the very young, the very old, and those already weakened by poor nutrition in the years before the crisis began. Grain prices in some areas are recorded as rising to roughly 4 times their normal level, placing basic survival suddenly and brutally out of reach for households that in an ordinary year would have managed perfectly well. And here is a detail that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it, because it runs against the instinct most of us have about how scarcity works. It was not only the poorest households that suffered during these years. Surviving records suggest that even some members of the lower nobility families, who would have considered themselves comfortably secure under normal circumstances, found themselves struggling to feed their households as grain became not just expensive, but in some periods and regions simply unavailable at any price. Scarcity at this scale did not respect the social hierarchies that ordinarily determined who ate well and who did not. It simply moved through a population from the bottom upward, more slowly for some than others, but eventually touching nearly everyone. There is also a detail from this period that I find quietly devastating in its specificity. Some chroniclers record instances of livestock being slaughtered not for food, but simply because there was no longer feed available to keep the animals alive through another season. And a starving animal was in its own way another mouth competing for resources that desperate families needed for themselves. This created a brutal kind of compounding loss. The same animals that would normally have provided meat, milk and labour for ploughing in better years were instead being lost entirely, which meant that even after the rains eventually stopped and harvests began slowly recovering, Communities found themselves trying to rebuild not just their grain stores but their entire agricultural capacity, often without the draft animals needed to plough fields efficiently in the seasons that followed. Scholars still debate exactly how much of the suffering during these years should be attributed purely to weather, and how much was worsened by the social and economic systems already in place before the rains began. Some historians point toward the fact that medieval Europe just before this crisis had been experiencing several centuries of steady population growth, expanding into marginal farmland that was only barely productive in good years and almost worthless in bad ones. When the weather failed, this expanded population already living closer to the edge than earlier generations had found there was far less cushion available than there might once have been. Other historians emphasize the role of local lords and grain markets, suggesting that hoarding price speculation and uneven distribution worsened a crisis that pure weather alone might not have made quite so severe. The honest truth, the kind of truth this channel tries to sit with rather than smooth over, is that both explanations are probably true at once, intertwined in ways the surviving evidence cannot fully untangle even today. What strikes me most sitting with this story is the sheer duration of it. A single bad winter is a crisis a household can usually survive drawing on reserves, on community support, on simple endurance. But 2 consecutive years of failed harvests followed by a third year of continued instability as agriculture slowly tried to recover exhausted reserves that had taken generations to build. Seed grain that should have been saved for planting was eaten instead out of pure desperation, which meant some fields simply could not be replanted, even once the weather improved, deepening the crisis in a way that had nothing to do with rain at all anymore, and everything to do with the slow grinding mathematics of survival once a system has been pushed past what it can absorb. There are accounts difficult to verify with complete certainty, but recorded by more than one chronicler of the period describing communities reduced to eating what would ordinarily have been considered entirely inedible. Bark stripped from trees and ground into something resembling flour, roots dug from frozen ground far earlier and far more desperately than they would normally have been harvested. The evidence for the more extreme accounts from this period remains incomplete, and is treated with appropriate caution by historians, since chroniclers of the time sometimes leaned toward dramatic language to convey the severity of suffering to readers who had not witnessed it directly. But even setting aside the most extreme claims, the documented core of this famine, the verified mortality, the recorded grain prices, the surviving tax records showing entire villages unable to meet their normal obligations, paints a picture of suffering that needs no exaggeration to be understood as genuinely severe. And underneath all of this, quietly, almost invisibly, something else was happening that very few people at the time could have recognized. Populations weakened by years of poor nutrition do not simply recover the moment a good harvest finally returns. Malnutrition leaves a kind of biological residue of vulnerability that lingers in a body and in a community long after the immediate crisis has technically ended. Children who survived these famine years, but survived them malnourished during crucial periods of growth, would carry the effects of that deprivation for the rest of their lives in ways medieval medicine had no language to describe, but that we can recognize clearly now looking back with the benefit of everything we have since learned about how the human body responds to sustained hunger. This matters, I think, for understanding what came next in this story, though. I do not want to move there too quickly tonight. For now, I want you to simply hold this image. A continent slowly drying out after 2.5 years of rain and ruin fields finally beginning to produce something close to a normal harvest again, communities exhausted in ways that went far deeper than empty grain stores. A population that had survived something enormous, but that had been quietly and visibly weakened in the process, in ways that would not fully reveal themselves until another kind of crisis arrived, one that none of them could have possibly imagined, still waiting decades away in a future none of them could see. For now the rains have stopped, the fields are green again, and in the relief of that recovery it would have been almost impossible for anyone living through it to sense what else was quietly settling into place just beneath the surface of those returning harvests. Winter in the medieval imagination was never simply a season, it was something closer to a recurring character in the story of a life. One that returned every year with its own personality, sometimes merciful, sometimes not. And people spoke of it the way you might speak of a difficult relative whose visit you could never quite predict. By the time we reached the years just after the Great Famine had finally loosened its grip, the rhythms of winter itself, the ordinary cold season that arrived every autumn, regardless of harvest quality, deserve their own close attention. Because surviving a single famine, however severe, was not the whole of the struggle. The struggle repeated itself every single year, famine or no famine, in the form of an ordinary winter that still had to be endured. The first genuine cold of the season rarely arrived all at once. It crept in gradually through a series of small, almost unremarkable signs that anyone living close to the land would have recognized instantly. The morning dew turning to frost on the grass, the last swallows departing south, the particular quality of light in late afternoon growing thinner and more silver with each passing week. For a household that had spent the autumn preparing, these signs were not unwelcome. They were simply confirmation that the season they'd been working toward all year had finally arrived. What is easy to forget sitting in a warm, electrically lit room many centuries later is just how completely darkness governed medieval winter life. At the latitude of much of northern Europe, the depth of winter could mean barely 8 hours of usable daylight, sometimes less compressed between a late sunrise and an early dusk. Nearly 2/3 of every day for weeks at a time existed in some form of darkness. An artificial light, the kind we now take entirely for granted, was neither abundant nor cheap. Candles made from tallow rendered animal fat were the most common source of light for ordinary households, and they were smoky, foul-smelling and consumed faster than most families could comfortably afford to replace. Beeswax candles burned cleaner and brighter, but they were expensive enough that they belonged almost exclusively to wealthier households or to churches where their light served a different kind of purpose entirely. This meant that for most people the practical day effectively ended when the sun went down. Work that could be done by firelight, simple mending, spinning wool, repairing tools continued a little while longer. But the long idle hours of true winter darkness were largely spent doing remarkably little by necessity rather than choice. And this brings us to something genuinely fascinating about medieval sleep patterns, something that modern sleep researchers have only recently begun to take seriously as a window into how humans likely slept for most of our history before artificial light reshaped our internal clocks entirely. There is a phrase that appears scattered throughout medieval texts, court records, and even early modern writings referring matter of factly to something called first sleep and second sleep, as though the concept needed no further explanation because everyone already understood it. The pattern these references describe is a segmented sleep cycle. A household would typically retire not long after dusk sleep for several hours, then wake naturally sometime in the middle of the night, often for an hour or more before settling back into a second period of sleep that carried them through until dawn. During that waking interval in the middle of the night, people did not lie anxiously staring at the dark the way many of us might today if we woke at 3 a.m. with nowhere to be and nothing to do. Instead, surviving accounts describe this period as a fairly ordinary, almost domestic stretch of quiet activity. Some people prayed, some talked quietly with a spouse or family member in the dark, the kind of unguarded conversation that seems to happen more easily at that hour than any other. Some simply lay awake thinking in a state that researchers today might recognize as something close to a naturally occurring, meditative interval built directly into the structure of a pre-industrial night. I find this detail genuinely moving the more I sit with it. We tend to assume that anxious, broken sleep is a uniquely modern affliction born of screens and stress and artificial light disrupting our natural rhythms. But the truth seems to be almost the opposite. Broken, segmented sleep may actually be the more biologically natural pattern for human beings, and what changed is not our nighttime waking, but our relationship to it. A medieval household, waking in the depth of a long winter night, simply accepted that interval as a normal part of rest, rather than experiencing it as the failure of sleep, the way so many of us do now when our eyes open at an hour the clock insists is too early. Scholars who study this period note that the practice appears to have persisted in some regions well into the early modern era, only fading gradually as artificial lighting became more widespread and the rhythms of industrial labour began demanding a single, uninterrupted block of sleep instead. Inside that long winter night, the fire itself became something closer to a member of the household than a simple source of heat. Keeping it alive through the night without the constant attention a fire requires during the day demanded its own quiet skill. Families learned to bank their fires before sleep, covering the coals with ash in a way that slowed their burn without extinguishing them entirely, so that come morning, those same embers could be coaxed back into flame with relatively little effort rather than requiring an entirely new fire to be struck from cold. This single unglamorous skill, the careful banking of a fire overnight, mattered enormously. A fire that died completely during a winter night was not simply an inconvenience. In the depths of true cold, it could become genuinely dangerous, and relighting one without modern matches or reliable tools meant relying on flint steel and patience, none of which were guaranteed to work quickly when fingers were already numb from cold. This is perhaps a good place to mention something that surprises many people when they first learn it. The animals sharing that same household space were not simply tolerated for practical farming reasons. In the depth of winter, the body heat produced by livestock kept just on the other side of an interior wall made a measurable difference to the warmth of the human living space beside it. A cow alone can generate a meaningful amount of ambient heat over the course of a night, and households that kept animals close, sometimes startlingly close by modern standards, were in a very real sense relying on that warmth as part of their overall strategy for surviving the cold. It was not simply convenient. In the coldest stretches of winter, it may genuinely have been the difference between a tolerable night and a dangerous one. And yet for all of this careful adaptation, for all the accumulated hard-won knowledge passed down through generations about fires and food stores and the careful management of darkness, winter still killed people. Quietly, individually, in ways that rarely made it into the grander chronicles of the period, but that survive instead in smaller, more local records. Parish documents from later centuries, when record-keeping became more consistent, show a clear and consistent pattern of elevated mortality during the coldest months, particularly among the very young and the very old, whose bodies had less capacity to regulate temperature and fight off the respiratory illnesses that spread more easily in crowded, poorly ventilated winter housing. How many of these deaths across the centuries we are exploring tonight came directly from cold itself, and how many came from the illnesses that cold conditions made more likely, is a distinction the historical record cannot always draw cleanly. Pneumonia, frostbite leading to infection, and the simple compounding strain that sustained cold places on an already malnourished body often work together, rather than separately, and medieval physicians, working without any understanding of germ theory, or the biological mechanisms behind these illnesses, generally recorded only the visible symptoms rather than the underlying cause. The evidence that survives gives us a clear pattern of suffering, without always giving us a precise explanation for every individual case within it, And that uncertainty, frustrating as it might be for anyone hoping for tidy answers, is simply part of being honest about what we can and cannot know from this distance. What we can say with confidence is that winter in this era was never something a household conquered once and then moved past. It was something endured repeatedly with the accumulated knowledge of countless generations who had faced the same darkness, the same hunger for daylight, the same careful tending of fire and food and animal warmth, and who had mostly found ways to make it through to the other side. But mostly is not the same as always, and there were certain years, certain particular stretches of cold that tested even the most prepared households in ways that ordinary winter preparation could never fully account for. Years when the frost arrived earlier than anyone expected, and stayed far longer than anyone had stored for. We are getting close to one of those years now, closer than the calm of this evening's story might suggest. Something interesting happens to a community after it survives a great hardship, and it rarely happens the way you would expect. There is no triumphant return to normal, no clean line drawn between crisis and recovery. Instead, what tends to happen is quieter and more complicated. The structures hold mostly, but they hold with new cracks running through them. Cracks that are not always visible until the next pressure arrives and finds them. This is where we find ourselves now in the decades following the worst of the Great Famine in a Europe that had technically recovered in the sense that harvests had returned to something resembling their earlier reliability and yet had not recovered in other ways that mattered just as much. Populations had been reduced. Trust in the systems that were supposed to protect people, the local lords, the church, the informal networks of mutual aid between neighbouring families, had in some places been quietly eroded by years of watching those systems strain and occasionally fail when they were needed most. I want to spend some time tonight on a detail of this period that rarely makes it into broader histories because it tends to get overshadowed by the larger catastrophes on either side of it. The years following the Great Famine saw a noticeable and well-documented shift in how communities related to outsiders, to strangers, and even to each other during difficult seasons. Famine, it turns out, does not simply test a community's food supply. It tests and sometimes permanently alters the unspoken agreements that hold a community together. Records from manorial courts in several regions, the local tribunals where everyday disputes between villagers were settled, show a measurable increase in cases involving theft of stored food disputes over grazing rights and accusations of hoarding during the years immediately following the famine, compared with court records from earlier, more stable decades. This is not entirely surprising on its face. Hardship tends to strain relationships everywhere in every era. But what is genuinely striking, and what historians studying these records have noted with some care, is how long this elevated tension persisted. In some regions, the pattern of increased local conflict over resources continued for a full generation after the famining years themselves had ended, suggesting that the experience had altered something deeper than simple food availability. It had altered how much people trusted one another to behave fairly when resources became scarce again. There is a particular kind of fracture that interests me more than any other tonight, though, and it concerns something that rarely appears in the grand narratives of medieval Europe at all. The relationship between villages and the natural world around them, particularly the forests, had always been delicately balanced, governed by customary rights that determined who could gather firewood, who could hunt small game, who could graze animals on common land and under what conditions. These customary rights, often unwritten, passed down through generations of practice rather than formal law, had functioned reasonably well during the centuries of relative stability before the famine. But the desperate years of food scarcity placed enormous strain on these arrangements, as households pushed further into common lands than custom normally allowed, gathering more wood hunting, more aggressively grazing more animals than the land could comfortably sustain. The forests themselves, in some documented cases, show signs of measurable depletion. During this period, a detail historians have reconstructed partly through analysis of surviving woodland records and partly through later complaints recorded decades afterward about forests that had never fully recovered their earlier density. Scholars still debate how much of this depletion can be attributed directly to the famine years specifically, since population growth in the centuries before the crisis had already been placing increasing pressure on woodland resources well before the rains of 1315 ever began to fall. What seems reasonably clear even amid that uncertainty is that the famine accelerated pressures that were already building, and that some communities entered the following decades with meaningfully less woodland buffer than they'd possessed a century earlier, at precisely the moment when reliable access to firewood mattered more than almost anything else for surviving an ordinary winter. And here is where these threads begin quietly to weave together into something larger. A weakened agricultural base, strained common resources, communities whose internal trust had been tested and in some cases thinned by years of hardship. None of this on its own constitutes a crisis. Communities absorb strain all the time, and most years even difficult ones pass without anything resembling catastrophe. But these conditions created something more dangerous than any single bad harvest could on its own. They created fragility, a reduced capacity to absorb the next genuine shock whenever it arrived in whatever form it took. Is it strange to think that a society's resilience can be quietly worn down over decades in ways too gradual for anyone living through them to notice? I do not think so honestly. I think it is one of the more universal truths this kind of history can offer us. Something that applies just as easily to households today managing financial strain that builds slowly over years as it does to medieval villages, managing the slow erosion of their forests and their food security. Crisis rarely announces itself in advance. It simply waits for the moment when accumulated strain finally meets a pressure the system can no longer absorb. There is also a quieter, more personal dimension to this fracturing that deserves attention, because it concerns something easy to overlook amid discussions of grain prices and forest depletion. The psychological residue of surviving a famine, particularly for those who have been children during the worst of it, appears to have shaped an entire generation's relationship to food scarcity and risk in ways that historians can trace through later behaviour, even if the people themselves left no direct testimony about their inner experience. Some scholars studying this period have noted patterns suggesting heightened hoarding behaviour, increased caution around lending food even to neighbours in good standing, and a general tightening of the communal generosity that had characterised earlier the more stable generations. This is, of course, difficult to measure with any real precision from documents written centuries ago, and I want to be honest about that limitation rather than presenting it as settled fact. But the pattern that does survive in court records and in the gradual tightening of customary lending practices, documented across several regions, suggests something real and lasting had shifted in how people related to one another after living through genuine sustained hunger. I think about this sometimes in relation to my own understanding of how hardship shapes people, even now, even in circumstances utterly unlike medieval famine. There is a particular kind of caution that tends to settle into anyone who has gone without something essential, a caution that can look from the outside like coldness or selfishness, but that is really something closer to a deeply learned, deeply rational fear of being caught unprepared again. I imagine that fear moved quietly through these villages for decades, shaping decisions in ways that nobody at the time would have described in quite those terms, but that we, looking back with the benefit of everything we now understand about trauma and memory, can recognise clearly enough. By the early decades of the 14th century, then we have a Europe that looks on the surface recovered. The fields are productive again. The worst of the famine mortality is a memory rather than a daily reality. Markets have stabilised. Trade routes that had been disrupted during the crisis years are functioning again, moving grain and goods across regions in roughly the patterns that had existed before everything fell apart. But beneath that recovered surface the cracks remain. Forests thinner than they once were, trust between neighbours slightly more conditional than it had been a century earlier. A population that, while no longer starving, carries within it an entire generation shaped by hunger in ways that would influence decisions for decades to come. And running through all of it, still largely invisible to the people living through these years, the same long, slow climatic shift that had triggered the original famine continued its quiet work unconcerned with whether Europe had recovered enough to absorb whatever came next. There is one more piece of this puzzle I want to bring in tonight, because it connects directly to where this story is eventually heading, even though its full significance would not become apparent for several more decades. Trade networks across Europe by this point had grown remarkably extensive, connecting port cities and inland markets across enormous distances, carrying not only grain and wool and wine, but also unknowingly carrying anything else that happened to be travelling alongside those goods. Rats, fleas, and whatever they carried with them moved along the same roads and rivers that carried grain to hungry markets, with nobody yet understanding the relationship between trade vermin and disease that we now take for granted as basic biological knowledge. This detail means nothing on its own sitting here in the early decades of the 14th century. It is simply a fact of how trade worked, unremarkable to anyone living through it. But I mention it now gently because every piece of this story we have built so far, the weakened population, the strained resources, the extensive trade networks, moving people and goods and unseen passengers across the entire continent, was quietly assembling the conditions for something that none of these tired, recovering villages could have possibly imagined it was coming. For now, though, the harvests are holding. The fires are warm enough. The worst, as far as anyone living through these years could tell, was already behind them. They had no way of knowing how wrong that quiet hope would eventually turn out to be. Word count 1,584. I should flag something honestly with you before moving on against the Master Guide's word count target of roughly 2,250 words for this part. This draft came in shorter at 1,584. The content beats new information, surprise detail, uncertainty marker, rhetorical question and mini hook are all present. But if you would like it expanded to fully match the timing table, let me know, and I will lengthen it rather than pad it. There is a strange irony sitting at the heart of this story, one that took modern scientists far longer to fully understand than you might expect, and it is this. The disease that would eventually become the single most devastating event in medieval European history did not actually prefer summer, the season when the insects that carried it were most active. It found some of its deadliest footing in winter, the very season this entire story has been built around, the season of crowded firesides, shared beds and sealed-up houses. We arrive now at the middle years of the 14th century, roughly 3 decades after the worst of the Great Famine had passed, in a Europe that had spent that time rebuilding, however imperfectly, the foundations the famine had shaken. The population had grown again, though not yet back to its earlier peak. The forests had not fully recovered, but the fields were productive. Trade moved steadily along the rivers and roads that connected every region of the continent to every other, carrying wool from England, wine from France, spices and silk arriving from far beyond Europe's own borders through ports along the Mediterranean. It was along exactly these trade routes sometime in the late 1340s that something arrived in Europe that would change the trajectory of this entire story more profoundly than anything that had come before it. Historians generally trace its arrival to ports along the Mediterranean, most likely carried aboard merchant ships that had travelled from the Black Sea region, where the disease appears to have already been spreading through populations to the east. From those first port cities it began moving inland along the same trade roads that had spent decades quietly recovering from the famine, carrying grain and wool, and unknowingly this time carrying something else entirely. What strikes me most sitting with this part of the story is how closely tied this catastrophe was to the very systems that had allowed Europe to recover from its earlier hardship. The trade networks that had helped distribute grain during difficult harvests, that had connected struggling regions to more fortunate ones, that represented genuine human ingenuity in building a more resilient, more interconnected continent, became almost overnight the precise mechanism through which devastation spread fastest and farthest. There is something genuinely sobering in that something that feels uncomfortably relevant even now. The same connections that protect a community in one kind of crisis can become its greatest vulnerability in another. Now here is where winter, the season we have spent so much time with tonight, enters this story in a way that surprises most people when they first learn it. The popular image of plague tends to involve summer, perhaps because the disease is most commonly associated with fleas, and fleas are generally understood to thrive in warmer conditions. But the historical record of the Black Death spread through Europe shows mortality continuing, and in some documented cases intensifying, through the winter months in ways that puzzled both the people living through it, and for centuries afterward, the historians and scientists trying to understand exactly how the disease behaved. The explanation that has gradually emerged pieced together through both historical record and modern epidemiological research involves a detail that genuinely surprised me the first time I encountered it. While the form of plague carried primarily by fleas does tend to slow during colder months, as the insects themselves become less active, another form of the same disease, one that spreads directly from person to person through close respiratory contact rather than through flea bites, appears to have played a significant role during the winter stretches of the outbreak. And if you think back to everything we discussed earlier tonight about how medieval households actually lived through winter, you will understand immediately why this matters so much. Families sealed into single rooms for warmth, multiple generations sleeping close together for shared body heat, animals kept nearby for the same reason. Every single adaptation that had evolved over centuries to help people survive the cold became in the presence of this particular disease a mechanism that made transmission between family members and close neighbours almost unavoidable. Scholars still debate the exact proportion of plague deaths during this period that should be attributed to this directly transmitted form versus the more commonly understood flea-borne version, since medieval records do not distinguish between them, and the symptoms to anyone observing without modern medical knowledge would have looked largely the same either way. What the evidence does suggest fairly consistently across multiple regions is that mortality during the cold months of this outbreak did not simply pause the way a purely flea-driven epidemic might have predicted. In some communities, the crowded conditions of winter sheltering appear to have made the disease's spread through a household nearly total once it arrived, with very few members of an affected family escaping infection, a pattern that differs meaningfully from outbreaks during warmer months when slightly more space between people and slightly less time spent indoors together seems to have occasionally allowed some family members to avoid exposure. I want to pause here and sit with something that I think genuinely deserves quiet reflection rather than quick movement past it. We have spent considerable time tonight admiring the ingenuity of medieval winter survival, the careful banking of fires, the shared warmth of bodies and animals, the deep accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned exactly how to keep a household alive through months of cold and darkness. And now here that same ingenuity, that same closeness, that same warmth that had protected these families from the cold for centuries became the precise vulnerability that a new and unprecedented threat would exploit most efficiently. There is no villain in this part of the story. There is no failure of wisdom or preparation. There is simply the unbearable, almost unspeakable irony that the very adaptations which had kept these families alive through everything this story has described so far were the same adaptations that, in this one specific circumstance, worked against them. How do you prepare for a danger built entirely out of the solutions to a different danger? I do not think there is a satisfying answer to that question, and I am not sure medieval communities, even with all their accumulated wisdom, could have arrived at one. Nothing in their experience, nothing in the generations of hard-won knowledge about surviving famine and cold could have prepared them for a threat that turned their own survival strategies into a liability. The mortality figures from this period remain even now genuinely difficult to comprehend in full. Estimates vary by region, and the surviving records are uneven, but historians broadly agree that somewhere between a third and perhaps as much as half of Europe's population died within the initial wave of this outbreak, which unfolded across roughly 4 years beginning in the late 1340s. Entire villages in some documented cases were left with no survivors at all, their fields abandoned, their houses left standing empty for years afterward, slowly being reclaimed by the same forest that had been pushed back over the preceding centuries of careful cultivation. And here quietly the thread we picked up earlier tonight comes back into view. The generation that endured the worst of this outbreak was not a generation entering the crisis at full strength. It was in significant part the children and grandchildren of the families who had survived the Great Famine decades earlier, a population that had already been shaped biologically and socially by sustained earlier hardship. Whether that earlier weakening made this generation more vulnerable to the disease itself remains a subject of ongoing scholarly discussion, since the plague's lethality was severe enough and its spread efficient enough that it likely would have devastated even a robustly healthy population. But it is difficult, sitting with the full arc of this story, not to wonder whether a less weary, less resource-strained Europe might have found slightly more capacity to resist and nurse the sick, to maintain the social bonds that had once held struggling communities together, even amid a catastrophe of this scale. What we know with more certainty is what came after, in the immediate aftermath of those first devastating years. The social and economic structures that had governed medieval life for centuries did not simply survive this shock unchanged. With so many dead, particularly among those who had worked the land, the basic economics of labour across Europe shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Workers who survived found themselves, for the first time in living memory, in a position to demand better terms from landowners desperate for anyone able to work their fields. Some historians consider this shift one of the genuine turning points in the slow transition away from the rigid social structures that had defined the earlier medieval period, though the full unfolding of those changes would take generations to complete. But that is a story for later in our evening together, and I do not want to rush ahead of where we currently stand. For now, I want to leave you with the image of that first terrible winter of the outbreak sometime in the late 1340s in a household not unlike the one we imagined at the very beginning of this story. A fire banked low against the cold, a family pressed close together for warmth exactly as their parents and grandparents had taught them, exactly as every generation before them had done to survive the season, doing everything right by every measure their world had ever given them to judge survival by, and facing without any way of knowing it a danger that their closeness itself had quietly invited in. The winter outside that door was in its own way almost beside the point now. A new kind of brutal had arrived, one this story has not yet fully described, and one that would leave almost nothing about the world that came after it unchanged. Grief in the years following the worst of the outbreak took on a shape that is almost impossible to imagine fully from where we sit now, centuries removed from it. Not the grief of losing one person, which is its own profound weight, but the grief of losing an entire world of familiar faces, all at once, of walking into a village you'd known your whole life and finding it rearranged by absence, half its houses standing empty, half its voices simply gone. This is where we settle tonight, in the raw immediate years after the first devastating wave had passed through, somewhere in the early 1350s, in communities still trying to understand what had actually happened to them, and what, if anything, they were supposed to do next. I want to start with something that rarely gets discussed when people talk about this period. Something that has nothing to do with mortality as statistics and everything to do with the practical, almost unbearable logistics of catastrophe on this scale. When a third or more of a population dies within a span of months rather than years, the ordinary mechanisms a society relies on for handling death simply collapse under the volume. Churchyards that had served a parish comfortably for generations suddenly faced more burials in a single season than they would normally see in a decade. Priests themselves dying at rates equal to, or sometimes exceeding, the general population, given how closely their duties brought them into contact with the sick, and dying became unavailable in many parishes precisely when their presence was needed most. Surviving records from several regions describe what historians now refer to as plague pits, large communal burial trenches dug on the edges of towns and villages, intended to handle a volume of dead that individual graves with their accompanying rites and ceremony simply could not accommodate quickly enough. I think this detail deserves to be sat with for a moment rather than moved past quickly, because it represents something genuinely difficult about this period that goes beyond simple mortality numbers. For a medieval Christian proper burial complete with last rites, a blessed grave, and the full weight of customary ceremony was not merely a practical matter. It was deeply tied to belief about the soul's passage into the next life. The widespread necessity of mass burial, stripped of nearly all the ritual that had always accompanied death, represented a kind of spiritual rupture layered directly on top of the physical catastrophe, a wound to a community's sense of order and meaning that mortality figures alone cannot fully capture. And here is something that surprises many people when they first encounter it, because it complicates the simple narrative of helplessness that often surrounds this period. Even amid this scale of devastation, evidence survives of remarkable sustained acts of ordinary courage. Religious orders, particularly certain communities of nuns and monks who had taken vows specifically oriented toward caring for the sick, continued their work throughout the worst of the outbreak, nursing the dying with a level of direct physical contact that, given what we now understand about transmission, placed them at extraordinarily high personal risk. Mortality among some of these religious orders during this period is recorded as having been catastrophically high in certain documented cases, approaching near total loss of an entire community's membership. These were not people unaware of the danger. Awareness of contagion, even without the modern science behind it, was widespread enough by this point in the outbreak that many understood proximity to the sick carried serious risk. They continued regardless, out of a sense of duty that the historical record preserves, with a kind of quiet, unforced dignity that I find genuinely moving every time I return to this part of the story. There is also a detail from this period that tends to unsettle people slightly less than you might expect once it is properly explained, and that concerns the question of how communities understood what was happening to them at all. Medieval physicians working entirely without germ theory, without any concept of bacteria or contagion in the sense. We understand today developed explanations for the outbreak that ranged from astrological alignments to corrupted air, often described using the term miasma to direct divine punishment for collective sin. None of these explanations, viewed from where we stand now, holds up scientifically. But it would be a mistake, I think, to dismiss them as simply foolish, because within their own framework of understanding they represented genuine, careful attempts to make sense of an utterly incomprehensible event using the best tools available at the time. Scholars still debate how much these explanatory frameworks shaped actual behaviour during the crisis, since the surviving evidence shows considerable regional variation in response. Some communities operating under the belief that bad air carried the disease took steps that by pure coincidence may have offered some genuine protective benefit, such as avoiding crowded indoor gatherings or burning aromatic herbs in spaces where the sick were being cared for, practices that would not have stopped transmission in any meaningful biological sense, but that may have in some incidental cases reduced direct contact in ways that mattered. Other communities operating under the belief that the outbreak represented divine punishment responded with increasingly severe forms of public penance in some well-documented cases, including processions of flagellants, groups who travelled between towns performing public acts of self-mortification intended to atone for sins believed to have caused the catastrophe. These processions ironically and tragically likely contributed to spreading the very disease they were attempting to appease, since they involved large groups travelling between communities and gathering in crowded public spaces, precisely the kind of contact that we now understand to have been most dangerous. I find myself returning again and again tonight to the particular cruelty embedded in so many of these responses. Not a cruelty inflicted by anyone with bad intentions, but a cruelty built into the gap between genuine human desperation to do something, anything, in the face of incomprehensible suffering, and the absence of any reliable knowledge about what that something should actually be. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see, cannot name correctly, and cannot understand through any framework available to you? Medieval communities tried prayer, penance, isolation, flight, and 100 smaller individual strategies, some of which likely helped at the margins, and many of which made no difference at all, or made things quietly worse. Flight itself deserves particular attention here, because it represents one of the more consistently documented responses across multiple regions, and one that carries a genuinely uncomfortable layer of moral complexity that historians continue to sit with carefully. Those with the resources to do so, generally wealthier households, members of the nobility and clergy with access to rural retreats away from densely populated towns, often did exactly what modern epidemiology would recommend, withdrawing from crowded settlements into more isolated countryside residences, reducing their exposure to others who might be carrying the disease. This strategy appears based on surviving mortality patterns to have offered genuine protective benefit in many documented cases, but it also meant that the burden of remaining in afflicted towns tending to the sick, maintaining whatever functions of daily life still continued, and facing the highest concentrations of risk, fell disproportionately on those without the means to leave, the poor, the elderly without family resources, and those whose labour or duty bound them to remain bore a meaningfully greater share of this catastrophe's weight than wealth and position might have otherwise protected anyone from in ordinary times. This is not a detail that fits neatly into a story about shared universal suffering, and I think it deserves honest acknowledgement rather than smoothing over, because it reveals something true about how even an indiscriminate biological threat can still move through a society along very old, very human lines of inequality. And yet alongside all of this, something else was happening, something quieter and slower that would not fully reveal its significance for decades, but that represents perhaps the most genuinely surprising thread running through this entire devastating period. The same catastrophic mortality that emptied villages and filled mass graves also almost immediately began reshaping the basic economics of survival for those who remained. With so many agricultural workers dead, the surviving labourers found themselves often for the first time in their family's living memory in a position of genuine negotiating power. Landowners desperate for anyone capable of working their fields began offering wages and conditions that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Some historians point to this period as the moment when the rigid social arrangements that had bound most peasants to a single lord's land for generations, arrangements historians often refer to using terms tied to serfdom and feudal obligation, began their long, gradual unravelling. This shift did not happen quickly, and it did not happen evenly across every region. Some landowners and ruling authorities responded by attempting to legally enforce the oldest wage structures, passing laws specifically designed to prevent labourers from demanding the higher pay that simple market scarcity would otherwise have commanded. These efforts met with mixed and often limited success, since enforcement across scattered rural territories proved genuinely difficult, and labourers who found one estate unwilling to pay competitive wages frequently simply moved to another that would. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how quickly these economic shifts translated into broader social change, since the surviving records are scattered, regional, and sometimes contradictory. But the broad pattern that emerges, supported by multiple independent lines of evidence from different regions, suggests that the labour scarcity created by this catastrophe set in motion economic and social changes that would continue unfolding for well over a century afterward, gradually reshaping the relationship between ordinary people and the land they worked in ways the families living through the immediate aftermath could not have possibly foreseen. There is something I find quietly remarkable in this, something that feels worth sitting with as we approach the latter half of this story together. An event of almost unimaginable horror, one that emptied villages and filled communal graves and left entire regions changed beyond recognition, also became, through purely structural and economic forces utterly indifferent to anyone's intentions, one of the mechanisms through which medieval society's rigid hierarchies began to loosen. This is not a silver lining in any meaningful sense. The suffering was real, immense, and should never be minimized or reframed as somehow worthwhile because of what eventually followed from it. But history rarely offers clean moral lessons, and one of the genuine, uncomfortable truths this period reveals is that catastrophe and consequence are often tangled together in ways that resist any tidy narrative we might wish to impose on them afterward. As the immediate crisis began slowly and unevenly to recede, the survivors faced a world that looked in almost every practical sense fundamentally different from the one their parents had known. Villages reorganized around far fewer people. Fields once cultivated by entire extended families now worked by a fraction of their former labor force, sometimes left fallow, entirely slowly returning to the same woodland that earlier generations had spent centuries clearing. Families rebuilt, married, had children, and resumed something resembling ordinary life, but they did so as people who had witnessed something that fundamentally altered how an entire generation understood mortality risk and the fragile, uncertain nature of the world they lived in. And winter, through all of this, continued arriving exactly as it always had, indifferent to everything that had happened in the years surrounding it. The same fires needed banking. The same firewood needed cutting. The same long nights of segmented sleep continued in households that in many cases now held far fewer people gathered around that same hearth than they once had. What this generation carried forward from these years into the decades and centuries that followed is a story that goes beyond simple survival, beyond the practical mechanics of fire and food and shelter that occupied so much of our attention earlier tonight. It is a story about how a civilization absorbs catastrophe and continues scarred, but functioning, carrying forward both the practical lessons and the deep, often unspoken psychological weight of what it endured. We are close now to the part of this story where the evidence itself, the bones, the records, the surviving fragments left behind by the people who lived through everything we have discussed tonight, begins to speak more directly in ways that modern science has only recently learned how to properly hear. There is a particular kind of patience required to read history out of a human skeleton, and it is nothing like the patience required to read it out of a chronicle. A monk writing 6 centuries ago could exaggerate, could embellish, could shape his account to serve a moral or political purpose he cared about more than strict accuracy. A skeleton cannot do any of that. It simply holds whatever truth happened to it quietly, for as long as it takes someone to learn how to ask it the right questions. This is where we turn our attention now away from the written record we have leaned on for most of this story, and towards something that has only become available to historians in the last several decades. The physical evidence itself. The bones, the teeth, the layers of soil, the chemical traces left behind in the very substance of the people who lived through everything we have described so far tonight. I want to begin with something genuinely remarkable, a detail that surprises almost everyone who first encounters it, regardless of how much history they already know. Human teeth, it turns out, keep a kind of diary. As a child's teeth form layer by layer, any period of significant physical stress, severe illness, prolonged malnutrition, leaves behind a visible mark in the enamel itself. A thin band of disrupted growth that remains permanently recorded in that tooth for the rest of a person's life. Readable centuries later by anyone who knows how to look. These marks are called enamel hypoplasia, and they have become one of the single most valuable tools available to historians on studying exactly the kind of hardship we have spent this evening exploring. When researchers examine the teeth of individuals buried during and after the famine years and the plague years we have discussed tonight, the pattern that emerges is sobering in its clarity. Elevated rates of these stress markers appear consistently in skeletal populations dated to these difficult decades, and the markers cluster as you might expect around the specific ages when we know from the written record that conditions were at their worst. A child who was perhaps 4 or 5 years old during the height of the Great Famine carries that fact quite literally embedded in the structure of their teeth, regardless of whether any document anywhere ever recorded that particular child's name or existence. This is the kind of evidence that does not lie, does not exaggerate, and does not require us to trust the perspective or motives of whoever happened to be writing at the time. Bone itself tells a similarly honest story, though it requires somewhat different expertise to read. Researchers examining skeletal remains from cemeteries used during the plague years have been able to study not only the immediate cause of death where evidence survives, but also the general health of individuals in the years leading up to their death, through markers like bone density, evidence of healed fractures, and signs of chronic illness that would have been invisible to anyone observing a living person without modern diagnostic tools. What this research has revealed with a consistency that scholars across multiple independent studies have now confirmed is that the generation hit hardest by the plague was on average already carrying a measurable burden of earliest life stress, much of it consistent with the kind of nutritional hardship associated with the famine decades earlier. This does not prove with absolute certainty that famine survivors were more biologically vulnerable to the plague, specifically since correlation across an entire population and direct causation in any individual case remain genuinely difficult to separate with evidence currently available. But it adds real physical weight to something the written record had only hinted at, the idea that this was not simply two separate catastrophes happening to occur near one another in time, but two catastrophes connected through the actual bodies of the people who lived through both. There is another more recent area of research that I find genuinely fascinating, and that has only become possible within the last 15 years or so, as the technology behind it has matured. Scientists studying ancient pathogen genetics have managed in a number of documented cases to extract fragments of actual genetic material from the teeth of individuals buried in plague cemeteries, preserved by an unusual quirk of biology in which the dense pulp chamber deep inside a tooth can sometimes protect biological material from degradation for centuries in a way that softer tissue never could. Through this work, researchers have been able to identify and sequence portions of the specific bacterium responsible for the outbreak, confirming with genuine scientific certainty something that historians had argued about for generations based on written symptoms alone. The disease that devastated 14th century Europe was in fact the same bacterial pathogen still capable of causing infection today, though, Modern medicine now understands it, treats it, and largely prevents it from ever reaching anything close to the scale it achieved during this period. This genetic research has also revealed something I think deserves a moment of quiet wonder before we move past it. By comparing genetic material recovered from multiple plague burial sites across different regions and different points within the outbreak's progression, scientists have been able to trace with surprising precision the pathogen's evolutionary path as it moved across the continent, essentially reconstructing a kind of family tree, showing how the disease spread, mutated slightly, and moved from one region to the next. This is a level of detail about a 600-year-old catastrophe that nobody living through it could have possibly imagined being knowable to anyone ever. And yet here we are, sitting with information about exactly how this disease travelled, that exceeds anything available, even to the most careful chroniclers writing in real time as it happened around them. The evidence remains incomplete in important ways, and I think it is worth being honest about that, rather than presenting this research as having answered every question. Genetic material survives unevenly across different burial sites, depending on soil conditions, burial depth, and a number of other factors not always under any researcher's control. This means the genetic record we currently possess, while genuinely revolutionary compared with what historians had available, even 30 years ago, still represents fragments rather than anything like a complete picture. Scholars continue to debate certain specific questions, including exactly how the disease's transmission patterns may have varied between different waves of the outbreak across the following centuries, and how much regional variation in mortality reflects differences in the pathogen itself versus differences in population density, nutrition, and social conditions from one region to the next. What moves me most about all of this evidence taken together is not really any single discovery on its own, but the broader thing it represents. For most of human history, the experience of ordinary people, the famine years, the plague years, the long winters spent banking fires and rationing bread, existed only in the form that more powerful or more literate observers chose to record about them, filtered through whatever biases and priorities those observers happened to carry. The physical evidence we have discussed tonight offers something different. It offers a way of hearing directly from the people themselves through the simple, unfiltered honesty of their own bodies, a testimony that required no education, no access to writing, and no permission from anyone more powerful to leave behind. The child whose teeth still carry the mark of a famine year nobody ever wrote down their name in connection with, has in a very real sense still managed to tell us their story. 6 centuries later, through nothing more than the simple fact of having survived something difficult enough to leave a permanent trace. I find that thought more than almost anything else in tonight's story genuinely comforting in a way that is hard to fully articulate. There is a kind of justice in it, however small and however many centuries delayed, in the idea that the people most often left out of the written record, the peasants, the children, the countless ordinary individuals who simply endured what history asked of them without ever having the chance to record their own account, are not actually as silent as we once assumed. They simply needed us to develop better tools for listening. There is one more piece of physical evidence I want to bring into tonight's story before we move toward considering how different observers at the time chose to interpret everything we have been discussing. Examination of skeletal remains from plague cemeteries has also allowed researchers to estimate with reasonable confidence the actual physical demographics of who was dying during the worst months of the outbreak, independent of whatever any single chronicler claimed at the time. This skeletal evidence broadly confirms what the written record suggested, that mortality during the worst periods cut across age groups far more evenly than ordinary disease outbreaks typically do. Taking the young and healthy alongside the old and already frail in a pattern that helps explain why contemporary observers describe the experience as so uniquely terrifying compared with the more familiar age-skewed mortality of an ordinary hard winter or an ordinary bad harvest. We have spent this part of our evening listening to bones and teeth and fragments of ancient genetic material speak their own quiet testimony. But the people who lived through these years also left behind their own voices, their own attempts to make sense of what was happening around them. And those accounts, when we set them beside one another, do not always agree. Some of those disagreements turn out to matter quite a lot. That is where we are headed next, into the surviving words of the people who are actually there, and the surprisingly different stories some of them chose to tell. A historian once described chronicles from this period as conversations between people who never met, separated by miles and sometimes decades, each one absolutely certain they were recording the plain truth of what had happened. I think about that description often because it captures something essential about the written record we are about to spend time with tonight. These were not careless or dishonest accounts, most of them. They were simply written by people standing in very different places, looking at the same set of events through entirely different windows. Tonight I want to sit with 3 of those windows in particular, because the differences between them reveal something genuinely important about how history gets remembered, and whose version of events tends to survive long enough for us to read it centuries later. The first window belongs to the monasteries. Monastic chroniclers represent some of the most detailed, most consistently preserved written accounts we have from this entire period for a simple practical reason. Monasteries had the literacy, the parchment, the stability, and the institutional continuity needed to maintain written records across generations in a way that almost no other medieval institution could match. When we read about grain prices during the famine years, when we encounter specific dates for the plague's arrival in a particular region, much of that information ultimately traces back to monks sitting in scriptoriums carefully recording what they observed or what travellers reported to them. But here is something worth sitting with honestly. Monastic chroniclers were almost by definition somewhat removed from the most desperate edges of peasant experience. Monasteries generally maintained more reliable food stores than ordinary villages, partly through more efficient management of their considerable landholdings, and partly through the simple advantage of being self-contained institutions less dependent on any single harvest. This does not mean monks were unaffected by famine or plague. Many monasteries suffered terribly, particularly during the plague years, given how directly their charitable and medical duties brought them into contact with the sick. But it does mean that when a monastic chronicler describes the famine years, he is often describing what he observed happening to others, to the desperate peasants arriving at the monastery gate seeking charity, rather than describing his own household's immediate hunger. The tone of these accounts understandably often carries a slightly different quality than a first-hand account of genuine personal deprivation would. There is frequently a moral or theological framework layered over the description, an instinct to interpret suffering as part of a larger spiritual lesson, which was not necessarily dishonest, but which does shape how the events get presented to us now. The second window belongs to the manor records, the practical, often dry, administrative documents kept by the stewards and officials who manage the day-to-day economics of a lord's landholding. These records rarely contain anything resembling narrative storytelling. They are lists mostly: grain yields, tenant obligations, court fines, rent collections, and yet in their own way these unglamorous documents may actually offer some of the most reliable evidence we have, precisely because they were never written with an audience or a moral lesson in mind. But he kept a manor roll to convince anyone of anything. They kept it because the lord needed an accurate accounting of what his estate had produced and what it owed, and an inaccurate record would have caused real immediate practical problems. This is where some of the most useful famine and plague-era evidence actually comes from. When a manor roll shows rent payments collapsing across an entire region within the same narrow span of months, that pattern reflects genuine economic reality far more reliably than any single chronicler's dramatic description ever could, because the people recording those numbers had no particular incentive to exaggerate or minimize what they found. Scholars studying this period have learned to treat the emotional narrative chronicles and the dry administrative manor records as complementary rather than competing sources, using the numbers to verify or temper the more vivid claims found in chronicle accounts, and using the chronicles to provide the human context and texture that bare administrative numbers could never capture. The third window, and the one I find myself returning to most often when I think honestly about whose experience tends to get lost from history, is the one we have almost no direct access to at all. The peasants themselves, the people whose lives this entire story has actually been about, left behind almost no first-hand written testimony of their own. Literacy in this period was concentrated overwhelmingly among the clergy, and to a lesser extent among wealthier merchant and noble households. The ordinary household we imagined at the very beginning of this story tonight. The family pressed close around a single fire through a long winter night, very likely could not read or write at all, and certainly left behind no journal, no letter, no personal account of what those years actually felt like from the inside. This absence matters enormously, and I think it deserves more attention than it usually receives. Everything we know about the lived experience of ordinary medieval families during these catastrophic years comes to us second-hand, filtered through the observations of literate outsiders, monks describing the desperate at their gates, manor officials recording the economic consequences of suffering they did not personally share, occasional court records capturing a peasant's voice only in the narrow adversarial context of a legal dispute. The actual interior experience, the fear, the grief, the small daily acts of love and sacrifice that almost certainly filled these households during their hardest years, exist for us now, mostly as something we have to carefully, respectfully infer, rather than something we can simply read in someone's own words. Is it possible to fully understand an experience you can only ever access secondhand? I am not sure it is completely, and I think honesty requires admitting that limitation rather than pretending the historical record gives us a fuller picture than it actually does. What we can do, and what careful historians have increasingly tried to do over recent decades, is read the existing sources against one another, noticing where the monastic account, the manor record, and the physical evidence we discussed earlier tonight align, and noticing where they diverge, because those points of divergence often reveal exactly where someone's particular perspective or interest was shaping what got written down. One especially telling area of divergence concerns the question of blame, something that appears constantly across surviving accounts of both the famine and the plague. But that gets assigned very differently depending on who is doing the writing. Monastic chroniclers working within a theological framework frequently attributed these catastrophes to divine punishment for collective sin, sometimes specifying particular sins they considered especially relevant, framing that whatever its spiritual sincerity also conveniently avoided assigning any blame to the practical decisions of landowners, grain merchants, or local authorities. Manor records, by contrast, occasionally preserve evidence of peasant grievances directed at exactly those practical decisions. Complaints recorded in court proceedings about hoarding, unfair pricing, or lords prioritizing their own household's provisions over their tenants' survival, suggesting that at least some people living through these years understood their suffering in much more concrete human and political terms than the more pious framing found in monastic accounts. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete regarding how widespread this more critical peasant perspective actually was, since it survives only in scattered fragments within legal records rather than in any sustained deliberate testimony. We cannot know with any real confidence what proportion of ordinary people during these years quietly blamed their lord's decisions rather than divine will, because the people most likely to have held that view were also the people least likely to have left behind any record of it at all. What we can say is that the surviving fragments we do have complicate any simple narrative suggesting medieval peasants universally accepted these catastrophes as purely religious or purely natural events beyond anyone's control. At least some of them, in at least some recorded instances, understood quite clearly that human decisions about grain storage, about pricing, about who received charity and who did not, had shaped how much they personally suffered, separate from whatever role weather or disease had played. I think this complexity matters sitting here tonight, because it resists the comfortable, simplified version of this story that would cast medieval people as passive, purely religious figures, simply enduring whatever fate handed them without complaint or critical thought. The reality, as it usually is with history, turns out to be more textured than that. These were people capable of genuine theological devotion and genuine practical grievance existing side by side, capable of praying for mercy while also in the next breath recognizing and resenting a lord who had hoarded grain while his tenants starved. As we move toward considering the lasting consequences of everything this story has covered tonight, I want to carry this lesson about perspective forward with us, because it applies just as much to how we understand the aftermath as it does to how we understand the events themselves. The famine and the plague did not leave the same mark on every person, every household, or every region in equal measure. Some recovered more quickly than others. Some carried forward grievances that would shape political tensions for generations, and understanding what came next requires holding on to exactly this awareness that the same catastrophe witnessed through different windows left behind not one single legacy, but many overlapping, sometimes contradictory ones, each waiting to unfold in its own time. Something quietly remarkable happens to wages in the decades following a catastrophe of this scale, and it is the kind of detail that rarely makes its way into popular memory of this period, even though its effects shape the lives of ordinary people far more directly than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. We pick up the thread now in the second half of the 14th century, in the long, uneven decades following the plague's first devastating wave, watching what actually happened to the structure of daily life once the immediate crisis had passed, and people were left to rebuild within a world that had been so dramatically thinned of its population. The most immediate and well-documented consequence concerns labour itself. With somewhere between a third and half of the agricultural workforce gone, the basic economics governing rural life shifted in ways that no one living through the famine decades earlier could have anticipated. Surviving wage records from English and continental estates alike show a measurable, sustained increase in what labourers could command for their work, sometimes documented as rising by as much as 50% within a generation, a shift driven by nothing more complicated than simple scarcity. There were fewer hands available to plough fields, harvest grain and tend livestock, and those who remained alive understood often for the first time in their family's memory that their labour had genuine leverage attached to it. This shift did not arrive without resistance, and the nature of that resistance reveals something important about how those holding power responded when the old arrangements began slipping. In England, authorities responded within just a few years of the plague's first wave by passing legislation specifically designed to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels, attempting to legally prevent labourers from benefiting from the very scarcity that their own survival had created. Similar measures appeared across parts of continental Europe as well, reflecting a shared anxiety among landowners that the old social order, the one where labour remained cheap and largely immobile, was beginning to unravel beneath them. Here is where something genuinely surprising enters the story, something that complicates the simple picture of obedient peasants accepting whatever terms their lords imposed. These wage restriction laws appear based on surviving court records documenting violations to have been widely and persistently ignored. Labourers who found one estate unwilling to pay competitive wages simply left for another that would, and the sheer scale of labour scarcity made it functionally impossible for landowners to enforce these restrictions consistently across an entire region. Scholars studying this period describe a kind of quiet, grinding standoff that played out over decades, formal law on one side, insisting wages remain frozen-lived. Economic reality on the other side, simply overriding that law through countless small individual decisions made by ordinary working people choosing where to take their labour. This tension eventually erupted into something more dramatic, though I want to be careful here not to let this story drift toward anything resembling sensationalism, because the underlying cause matters more than the drama of the event itself. In the latter half of the 14th century, accumulated frustration over wage restrictions combined with new and deeply unpopular taxation imposed to fund ongoing warfare culminated in widespread popular uprisings across parts of England and the continent, events historians now study as some of the earliest large-scale expressions of organised peasant political grievance in medieval European history. These uprisings were generally suppressed, often brutally, and did not immediately overturn the social structures their participants were protesting against, but historians broadly agree that the underlying economic shift driving these tensions, the genuine scarcity of labour and the leverage it created, continued working its slow effect on rural society, regardless of whether any single uprising succeeded or failed in the moment. I find myself drawn sitting with this part of the story to a question that feels almost uncomfortably relevant even now. How much does genuine social change actually depend on dramatic visible events like uprisings, and how much depends instead on slower, less visible economic pressures, simply grinding away in the background for decades until the old arrangements can no longer hold their shape? The evidence from this period suggests the second factor mattered enormously, perhaps more than the uprisings themselves, even though the uprisings tend to receive far more attention in popular retellings of this era. There is another consequence of this period that deserves its own quiet attention tonight, one connected more directly to the agricultural and environmental threads we picked up earlier in our evening together. With so much farmland suddenly lacking the labour needed to work it, significant amounts of marginal cropland, the same kind of barely productive land that population growth in earlier centuries had pushed communities into cultivating, were simply abandoned during this period. Some of this land returned slowly to woodland in a kind of unintended ecological recovery, driven entirely by human tragedy rather than any deliberate conservation effort. Forest cover in parts of Europe which had been under sustained pressure for centuries before the famine and plague years appears in some regions to have stabilised or even modestly increased during the decades following the worst mortality, a detail that environmental historians have only been able to reconstruct relatively recently through careful analysis of pollen records preserved in lake sediments and peat bogs. Scholars still debate how widespread and significant this reforestation effect actually was across the continent as a whole, since the evidence varies considerably by region and depends heavily on local factors like soil quality and how quickly surviving populations chose to resume cultivation of abandoned land. But the pattern that does survive, however regionally uneven, offers a strange kind of quiet symmetry to everything we have discussed tonight. The forest that had been pushed back over centuries of population growth and agricultural expansion, the same forests strained further during the desperate years of the famine, found in the plague's terrible aftermath. An unintended, unwanted kind of respite, regaining ground precisely because so many of the people who had been clearing it were no longer alive to continue that work. The consequences extended into areas of life that might seem at first glance entirely unrelated to economics or environment, but that trace back to the same underlying demographic shift. Marriage patterns across much of Europe appear to have changed measurably in the decades following the plague. with some demographic historians documenting a tendency toward earlier marriage and higher birth rates in the immediate aftermaths, a pattern consistent with what population scientists generally observe following any catastrophic mortality event, as surviving communities respond consciously or not to the sudden abundance of available land resources and opportunity left behind by those who died. This demographic rebound, gradual and uneven, as it was meant that the population low point reached during the worst years of the plague did not represent a permanent new normal, but rather the bottom of a curve that would slowly, unevenly climb back upward over the following century and beyond. What strikes me most, gathering all these threads together, as we approach the later portion of our evening, is how thoroughly interconnected these consequences turned out to be, even though they touched areas of life that the people living through them would likely never have thought to connect with one another. A wage law passed in response to labour scarcity, a forest slowly reclaiming abandoned farmland, a shift in when young couples chose to marry. None of these considered alone seems particularly dramatic, but taken together they reveal something genuinely significant about how a single catastrophic period can quietly reshape the entire underlying structure of a society, not through any single dramatic turning point, but through hundreds of smaller adjustments accumulating slowly across decades, each one a direct, traceable consequence of the famine and plague years this story has spent tonight exploring. There is one more thread I want to leave hanging gently as we move toward the closing portion of this story, because I think it deserves the fuller attention we will give it shortly. Everything we have discussed so far tonight, the wage shifts, the abandoned farmland, the changing marriage patterns, represents consequences that unfolded over years and decades, visible eventually in records and statistics, even if no single person living through them could have perceived the full pattern at the time. But there is also a quieter, more intimate kind of legacy one carried forward not through laws or land use, but through habits, traditions, and small inherited fragments of practical wisdom that found their way gradually and almost invisibly into the world that exists around us even now. That is where this story will eventually settle, in the quiet, surprising threads connecting everything we have discussed tonight to the world you are sitting in right now, listening to this in the dark. There is a habit many people still carry without ever knowing where it came from. Something so ordinary, it barely registers as a habit at all, and it begins, as far as historians can trace it, in exactly the world we have spent this evening exploring. The simple, almost unconscious act of saying a blessing before a meal, of pausing for even a single breath before eating, traces back in part to centuries when a full table was never something to take for granted, when the gap between having enough and not having enough could be measured in a single failed harvest. We have arrived now at the part of this story where I want to widen the lens slightly away from the specific years and specific catastrophes we have spent most of tonight inside, and toward the longer, quieter legacy that the medieval relationship with winter hunger and survival left embedded in the world that came afterward, including, in small and unexpected ways, the world you're living in right now. Some of these legacies are architectural, and they are easier to trace than you might expect. The particular shape of older European farmhouses, especially in regions that experienced the harshest medieval winters, often reflects design choices that emerged directly from centuries of trial and error in exactly the kind of household we imagined at the start of this story. Low ceilings, which modern visitors sometimes assume reflect simply the shorter average height of medieval people, actually served a more practical purpose as well, since warm air rises and a lower ceiling meant less volume of air, a single fire needed to heat. Thick walls, small windows, and the deliberate clustering of buildings close together in many medieval villages, rather than spreading out across available land, all reflect the same underlying logic, an architecture shaped by centuries of learning, exactly how much heat a fire could realistically provide and designing every other element of daily life around that hard limit. There is a more surprising architectural legacy as well, one connected directly to the household animals we discussed earlier tonight. In certain regions of northern and eastern Europe, farmhouse designs that kept living quarters directly adjacent to animal stalls sharing walls, and sometimes even sharing roof space, persisted in rural use well into the 19th century, and in some genuinely remarkable documented cases into the early 20th century, long after the famine and plague years that helped establish the practice had become distant historical memory. The logic that originally justified this arrangement, the simple physics of shared warmth, proved durable enough to outlast the specific crises that first made it essential, becoming, instead, a quietly inherited piece of practical wisdom passed from one generation of builders to the next, largely without anyone needing to explain or justify why the houses were built that way. Food traditions carry an equally traceable thread, and I think this is where the legacy becomes genuinely tangible in a way that touches daily life even now. The preserved foods that became essential survival tools during medieval winters, the salted and soaked meats, the dense breads made from whatever grain a harsh climate could reliably produce, the pickled and fermented vegetables that could last through months without refrigeration, did not simply disappear once their original survival purpose faded. They evolved instead into the foundation of entire regional cuisines that persist today, often celebrated now for their flavor and cultural identity, rather than remembered for the desperate practical necessity that originally shaped them. The specific distinctive taste of many traditional European cured meats and fermented foods exists in a very real sense, because medieval households needed a way to make a harvest last through 6 months of darkness and cold, and the techniques they developed, refined across countless winters and countless small adjustments, eventually became cuisine rather than simple survival. I want to pause on something here that I find genuinely moving, to think about something that connects this culinary legacy back to the deeper emotional thread running through tonight's entire story. Many of these preserved foods, even now, carry strong associations with comfort, family, and a particular kind of seasonal warmth. The dishes people specifically crave in winter specifically associate with gathering close to loved ones during the coldest months of the year. Is it possible that this association, this deep cultural pull towards certain foods specifically during cold weather, traces back further than mere personal nostalgia, reaching all the way into centuries of genuine survival need that has long since faded from conscious memory, but somehow never fully left our collective sense of what winter comfort is supposed to feel like? I do not think this can be proven with the kind of certainty a strict historian would require, and I want to be honest about that uncertainty rather than presenting it as settled fact. But the pattern feels suggestive enough sitting here tonight that I find myself genuinely drawn to the possibility. The sleep patterns we discussed earlier in this story carry their own quiet legacy as well, one that connects directly to modern scientific research happening right now, in ways that genuinely surprised the researchers who first encountered it. When sleep scientists in recent decades began studying human sleep architecture in controlled settings without any artificial light exposure, removing modern conveniences and simply allowing study participants to experience darkness the way medieval households would have, several independent research efforts documented participants naturally settling into something closely resembling the historical pattern of segmented first and second sleep-waking, naturally, in the middle of an extended night period before returning to a second period of rest. This research remains an active area of ongoing scientific investigation, and the evidence base, while genuinely intriguing, is still considered preliminary by many sleep researchers, since study sample sizes in this particular line of research have generally been small and the long-term implications are still being explored. but it offers a striking, almost poetic kind of continuity with everything we discussed earlier tonight about how medieval households experienced their winter nights, suggesting that the segmented sleep pattern those families lived with may reflect something closer to a deep biological default for human beings gently overridden by centuries of artificial lighting, rather than anything specific to their particular era or circumstances. There is a final thread of legacy I want to bring forward tonight, one that returns us to the broader arc of social and economic change we touched on earlier, regarding the loosening of rigid feudal structures in the plague's aftermath. Historians studying the long transition away from medieval social and economic arrangements generally agree that the labour scarcity created by repeated catastrophic mortality during this period represents one of several significant contributing factors in a much longer transformation, one that unfolded gradually across subsequent centuries, eventually contributing to fundamental shifts in how European societies organised land ownership, labour and social mobility. This is not a claim that the famine and a plague directly caused everything that followed in European history over the next several centuries, since countless other factors, political, religious and technological, contributed to those changes as well. But the demographic shock of this period appears based on the convergence of evidence from multiple independent historical and economic studies to have meaningfully accelerated changes that might otherwise have unfolded much more slowly, removing some of the structural rigidity that had defined rural life across earlier medieval centuries. What I find myself sitting with, gathering all of these threads together as our evening moves toward its quiet close, is a particular kind of wonder at how thoroughly the past continues living inside the present, usually without any of us noticing. The shape of an old farmhouse roofline, the specific comfort of a particular winter dish, the strange, persistent pull many people feel to wake briefly in the middle of the night without quite knowing why. None of these things announce themselves as history. They simply exist quietly woven into daily life, carrying forward fragments of knowledge and adaptation that an entire civilization once needed desperately to survive, long after the desperate need itself has faded from memory. The people who lived through everything this story has described tonight could not have imagined that their habits, their architecture, their carefully developed methods for preserving food and managing fire and getting through a long dark night would still be quietly present in the world. 6 or 7 centuries later, carried forward not through any deliberate effort at preservation, but simply through the patient and glamorous persistence of practical wisdom passed from one generation to the next. There is one final piece of this story I want to leave for the very end of our evening together, something that brings us gently back to where we began inside that single cottage beside that single fire on that long winter night so many centuries ago. There is a particular silence that settles over a house in the deepest part of a winter night. And if you have ever experienced it, really experienced it, lying awake while everyone around you sleeps, you already understand something that connects you directly to every person in the story we have spent this evening telling. Let us go back one final time to that single room we began with so many hours ago now. The fire has burned down to its last quiet bed of embers, banked carefully beneath a thin covering of ash, the way it has been banked every night this winter, the way it will be banked again tomorrow and the night after that for as long as this particular season chooses to stay. The family inside that room is asleep mostly. It is somewhere in the depth of the night now, that quiet stretch between first sleep and second sleep we spoke of earlier, and 1 or 2 of them are awake without quite meaning to be lying still in the dark, listening to the small ordinary sounds of breathing around them. The wind outside has settled. The animals on the other side of the wall have gone quiet. There is nothing dramatic happening in this room. There never really was, not in the way we usually mean that word. There is only warmth carefully kept, food carefully stored, people held close against a cold that has tried every year for as long as anyone can remember to take something from them. I want to spend these last few minutes with you gathering up the threads we have followed tonight, not to recite them back to you the way a lesson might, but to let them settle into something quieter, something closer to what I actually believe this story is about. We began in autumn watching a household prepare with the kind of patient, unglamorous intelligence that rarely gets celebrated in the history books built around kings and conquests. We watched them count their firewood ration, their candles weigh the brutal arithmetic of which animals could be fed through to spring, and which could not. We learned that an entire civilization's nights were once divided into 2 separate sleeps, with a quiet, wakeful hour resting peacefully between them, an hour that medicine and memory have only recently begun to recover for us 6 centuries later. We learned that warmth itself was something earned through closeness, through the careful, deliberate sharing of breath and body heat between people, and even between people and the animals who shared their walls. Then the rains came in the spring of 1315 and would not stop. We watched an entire continent's careful preparation fail against something no single household's woodpile or grain store could withstand. A climate quietly shifting beneath everyone's feet, understood by no one living through it, named by no one for centuries afterward. We sat with the Great Famine with its starving animals and its emptied granaries with the generation of children whose teeth we now know still carry the record of exactly how hungry those years truly were. We watched that generation recover imperfectly, carrying forward a kind of caution, a thinning of trust between neighbours, a forest never quite as full as it had been a century before. And we watched helplessly as the very closeness that had protected these families from the cold for centuries became the precise mechanism through which an entirely new catastrophe found its way into their homes. The plague did not care how carefully a fire had been banked. It did not care how much wisdom a family carried about surviving winter. It simply moved quietly and efficiently through the same warmth that had always kept these households alive. And then somehow impossibly life continued. Fields were replanted by fewer hands than before. Forests crept back over land that hunger had once forced open. Wages rose, laws tried and failed to stop them. And somewhere in that long, grinding tension between law and lived necessity, the rigid shape of an entire social order began slowly to loosen. What I find myself returning to gathering all of this together tonight is not really any single event in this story. It is something underneath all of them. A pattern that repeats itself across centuries, across continents, across every form of hardship human beings have ever faced. Catastrophe arrives indifferent to anyone's preparation or virtue. It takes what it takes. And then quietly, without fanfare, without anyone deciding it should happen, life resumes. Not because the people living through it were exceptionally brave or wise in some way we have since lost. Simply because resuming is what people do. It is perhaps the single most consistent fact in the entire historical record, more reliable than any king's reign or any empire's borders. However badly a season breaks a people, however many graves it fills, the people who remain tend to plant again. There is a piece of evidence I have been saving for this exact moment because I think it holds something close to the heart of everything we have discussed tonight. In certain parish records from the decades following, the worst of the plague and among the dry administrative listings of births, deaths, and land transfers that survive from this period, historians have found something unexpectedly tender. Marriage entries in some of these records begin appearing again within months of the worst mortality, sometimes between people whose families had been entirely unconnected before the catastrophe, households drawn together, not by old village alliances, but by simple shared survival, by the practical and emotional necessity of rebuilding a life alongside someone else who understood, without needing to be told exactly what had been lost. These were not romantic unions in the way we might imagine that word today. They were often practical, sometimes arranged within weeks of a previous spouse's death, driven by the urgent need to manage Landray's surviving children and simply continue functioning as a household in a world that had been so suddenly and brutally thinned. And yet within that practicality, something genuinely moving persists. People, having watched an entire world crumble around them, chose again and again to build something new beside another person rather than retreat into isolation. They chose connection, even amid devastation, especially amid devastation. I think that detail matters more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, because it tells us something true about what actually carries a people through catastrophe. Not heroism, not any single great act of courage that gets remembered in a chronicle. Just this quietly repeated across thousands of ordinary households. The decision made again and again to keep building a life alongside other people, even when every reasonable measure of the world might have suggested that building anything at all was pointless. This is, I think, the real inheritance this story leaves us more than any farmhouse roofline or preserved recipe or fragment of ancient bacterial genome recovered from a 600-year-old tooth. The inheritance is this pattern itself. The fire gets banked. The bread gets shared. The marriage happens even in grief, even in uncertainty, because the alternative to building something new is simply to stop and people. With almost unbearable consistency across every century, we have any record of choose not to stop. Now I want to slow down with you here at the very end of our evening together. I want to leave the histories behind for a moment. The dates, the numbers, the chroniclers and their disagreements. I want to return simply to the room. The fire is almost gone now, just a faint orange glow beneath grey ash, barely enough light to see by, exactly enough to keep something alive until morning. Outside the snow keeps falling, soft, steady, indifferent to everything that has happened and everything that will happen after. It falls over the thatched roof of that one cottage we have visited again and again tonight. It falls over a village that does not exist anymore in a form that anyone today would recognize. It falls over fields that have been planted and abandoned and planted again century after century by hands that are long gone now, every one of them. And somewhere in a different kind of darkness, in a different kind of quiet, it is falling now in some sense over you. The night is long, it always has been. People have always lain awake somewhere in the middle of it, listening to the small sounds of breathing nearby, waiting without quite knowing they were waiting for the first pale edge of morning. They did not know, most of them, that anyone would ever tell their story. They were not trying to be remembered, they were only trying to get through the night. And somehow enough of them did for long enough that we are still here to wonder about them at all. The fire has gone out now, the ash is cold, and somewhere in the quiet dark of your own room, something in you already knows exactly how to wait it out. Sleep well.